The story begins with a supervisor pointing to a blackboard and telling his subordinates that it depicts something youthful, yet classic. Finishing his explanation about style, he heard a squelch and looked around for the source of the sound. That sound was made by one of his subordinates. She was drinking a drink through a straw. The boss opened his eyes dumbfoundedly, looking at her, his face covered in sweat. The girl with pink hair continued to drink, ignoring his stare. She sped up afterward and suddenly volleyed her glass almost empty. The supervisor was very surprised as he thought she had drunk the entire drink at once. The girl sat with a mouthful of drink, not swallowing, and not letting the tube out of her lips. The warden continued to stare at her, his irritation reaching a fever pitch. The girl continued to sit with her mouth full, not knowing what she should do in this situation. She then spit the drink back into the glass through the tube with a loud sound. The supervisor's face creased. He thought her act looked disgusting. His name was Aiden, and another staff member asked him if he could continue the presentation. Gritting his teeth, he politely agreed to continue, apologizing. Crushingly wiping his head with his handkerchief, Aiden wondered if she could be normal for just one day, after all. She had gotten him in trouble. The hands of the wall clock indicated the time at 10 to 7. At this time, the girl's attention was consumed by a game of Tetris, where she was lamenting the fact that she didn't have enough sticks to clear the line. The girl resented the fact that she was getting one square, and Aiden thought irritably that she wasn't even thinking about getting to work. Approaching the girl's workstation, he caught her attention with a light tap of his finger on the desk. Aiden turned to her, demanding that she get to work now that she had played, and forbade her to go home until she provided 3 finished projects on his desk. The girl looked innocently at her superior, sipping her drink through the tube. The girl looked at him with an affectionate look from beneath her pink bangs, and gently asked if that meant he wanted to spend the night with her. The supervisor stared at her with his eyes goggle-eyed and mouth open, speechless. Finally coming to his senses, he explained that he was going home, and she was going to email the work. The girl was amused, and she shoved a stack of papers in Aiden's face, laughing, and asked him if he really thought she was playing when the work wasn't done. The supervisor looked at the employee's robot with a broken heart and began to play the same old game, shouting that the stick was no longer suitable for her and that she needed squares. Scowling and grinning, Aiden realized that his subordinate was bullying him and punching himself in the chest. He promised himself to teach the employee a lesson one day, since he was her boss, and therefore stronger. The chief's sad musings were interrupted by the light tap of a fingernail on his desk. Raising his eyes, the manager saw a subordinate slightly bent over his workplace, who coquettishly squinted her eyes under long lashes while holding a sunny drink in her hands, and smilingly asked the boss if he would like to drink juice. Aiden thanked embarrassedly, while thinking that now she was forcing him to feel awkward. The girl with pink hair hung her bag on her shoulder, and smiling radiantly said goodbye to her boss until tomorrow. Aiden remained silent, not turning his head, and she left, slamming the door behind her. A sign with the name of the studio where they worked glowed on the deserted street. Aiden sat down at his workstation, continuing to do his business, and moved the juice closer to him. After a while of continuing to work, he began to sip the orange juice in small sips through the tube. As he finished his drink, a message on his phone caught Aiden's attention, and he glanced at it with one eye. It was Alice Young, who had just left at the end of the workday and was now asking her boss if he'd had his juice. Aiden sent a short one-word message in which his answer was conclusive. The girl wrote that she had used the tube. The warden was in complete bewilderment while holding a mouthful of juice. After reading the information, Aiden poured it out of his mouth back into the glass in disgust. Then, to the supervisor's questioning suggestion, Alice Young cheerfully wrote that she was joking. Aiden's reply was written in a brief, unintelligible symbolism with exclamation marks at the end, signifying annoyance that he didn't even have the words for. The girl with the pink hair received a message from an angry Aiden demanding that he stop bullying him. Alice, holding her phone with open messages from a recent correspondence in her hand, thought for a moment. She was riding in an empty train and she was inevitably sleepy, and then she dozed off. Driving across the bridge over the river through the lighted evening city, Alice pronounced in her dream that she was not bullying her boss. Alice and her broken computer. In the empty apartment, the sounds of an electronic lock beeping were heard from the closed apartment. Aiden opened the door, and as he entered the apartment, he announced with a smile that he was already home. His empty room came into view, and there was absolutely no one else in it but Aiden. Lying on the bed, Aiden thought he should stop doing this, for it was a pathetic sight. A 33-year-old single man returning to an empty house. He continued to lie on the bed brooding, staring gloomily at the ceiling. Suddenly it hit him. He grabbed his phone and quickly started dialing someone's number. Aiden called his old friend Jason. He said hello, told him it was him, Aiden, and remarked that they hadn't talked in a while. Jason apologized and said he would call back later, then asked to hang up. Aiden dropped the call, and only the sound of short beeps came to his ears. Tossing the phone on the bed, he continued to lie there, staring up at the ceiling with a bored look. Doing nothing, Aiden was in the same position. in the pale light of the room lamp. His gaze fell on the device, a talking robot that stood on the nightstand beside the bed. Lying on the bed with the speaker under his arm, Aiden asked him how he could get a girlfriend. The device emitted a short beeping sound while processing his question. Soon, the robot replied that unfortunately, that was impossible. Aiden grinned and called it a piece of garbage. The robot beeped again, taking his phrase as the next question, and busied itself with processing the answer. The device then responded that it had the same opinion of its master. That pissed Aiden off. Jumping up, he threw the robot on the bed and began beating it with a pillow in a rage. After that, Aiden sat up on the bed, exhausted. The robot, lying beside him, repeated a meaningless set of phrases. Alone, he thought sadly about how much he wished he could talk to someone. Suddenly, there was a ringing sound. Aiden turned around in surprise and saw that it was the phone ringing. Taking the phone in his hands, he saw the caller's name on the screen. It was none other than Alice. Answering the phone, Aiden heard her say something about him being so cold and she was offended. Puzzled, he asked what she wanted. Alice, tapping her fingers on the keyboard, replied that she needed to edit an important part and the computer wasn't working. She asked Aiden to come over and fix it. Grinning irritably, he said that actually he had just gotten home. Alice replied that if she didn't finish today, she wouldn't be able to go home, and since he didn't live far away and wasn't busy, she asked him to fix the computer for her. In response, Aiden angrily countered that he had plenty of things to do at home. Alice, humming, said that he was probably asking his robot for advice, like how to get a girlfriend, for example. Aiden was stricken and confused by how accurately she had guessed what he was doing back home. In response, he shouted at her that he didn't do that, it wasn't normal, and let her repair her computer herself. Alice was almost deafened by the sudden shouting. Abandoning the phone, Aiden collapsed on the bed. Annoyed, he told himself that she thought he was an idiot and that she couldn't even fix her computer. Breathing heavily, he lay on the bed, still clutching his cell phone tightly in his hand. Gradually, Aiden calmed down, his breathing becoming more even and his face less irritated. Suddenly, he jumped out of bed and, spewing curses, hurried to the door, put on his shoes, and went outside. The windows of the studio where they worked were still glowing brightly, illuminating the evening street. A sudden sound caught Alice's attention. Sitting at the computer she turned around, holding the tube in her mouth. Aiden stood in front of her, out of breath, and looked at her with a look of bewilderment. Alyssa said she was just kidding and didn't think he'd actually show up for work. Aiden was furious. Drops of sweat appearing on his face, he looked at her angrily. Alice, however, took the tube out of her mouth, let out a joyful exclamation, and smiled broadly. She playfully said she would try to guess. He was worried about her after all, wasn't he? Aiden's face twisted with rage and embarrassment. He opened his eyes wide and blushed thickly. Quickly rushing past Alice, he rushed to the door and with a loud slam jumped out into the street. Alice continued to sit at the computer, her face thoughtful and a little surprised. After sitting like that for a bit, she hummed with a slightly disappointed expression on her face. Then, pushing back her chair, Alice stood up from her desk, leaving her workstation. Stretching and kneading her arms, she headed for the microwave and electric kettle. There were 2 packages of instant noodles waiting for Alice. She thought that now she would have to eat them all herself. Alyssa and a model, a normal workday. Aiden and Alice were discussing a flyer advertising a summer event. Aiden said that the customers were fine with everything except the model because they wanted an attractive girl in a bikini, whereas the flyer showed a mustachioed man. With an irritated snicker, Alyssa said that they had wanted him first. Aiden replied that that was the way it was, and offered to see what was in the gallery. He opened a picture of a blonde girl in a pink swimsuit and asked, Alice, what she thought of her. Alice gasped loudly, recoiling, causing Aiden to give Aiden a perplexed hum. She said that the girl in the photo was too gigantic and questioned whether anyone would even have the courage to take a flyer like that. Aiden frowned angrily in response. He offered another photo that showed a very young girl in a covered pink swimsuit with a skirt and a transparent inflatable circle. Alice shuddered and pointed her finger at the screen, muttering something about this girl being too young for such photos. Standing behind Aiden's back, she started talking about handcuffs, which started to piss him off a little. Aiden turned around irritably and suggested that Alice pick one herself, since she had an eye for models. She retorted by claiming that he just wanted to say mean things about her choice. Aiden disagreed, emphasizing that he wasn't a child. Alyssa went to her workplace to look for options, and Aiden warned that he would say terrible things. It had been a long time, and already the clock struck 10 to 7. Alyssa hesitantly stepped up with a model she liked that didn't show most of her face, and justifiably said her pose was really cool. Aiden concentrated with an upturned face and open mouth as he considered the proposal, approved and praised her choice, adding that the model's body was beautiful. Alice was extremely surprised, and with wide-eyed eyes still holding the photo in front of him, she clarified if what he had just said was true. Lamenting aloud that he had wasted his time, Aiden replied that the model's looks were beautiful. Alice smirked evilly as her superior's answer satisfied her completely. Immediately, she quickly unfolded the photo in which the model appeared to be herself, and said she took the photo while she was on vacation. Holding the photo so that Aiden could see the identity of her with the image in the photo, Alice asked herself if she was a beauty in his opinion. Aiden didn't like all of this and frowned. After that, his nerves gave way and his face turned ugly as he didn't want Alice's approval as a model. The girl at that time approached the manager, Kim excitedly bringing up her photo, saying that Aiden had just said that this model had a beautiful body, and that he would guess something, which she didn't have time to finish or listen to the guess, as Aiden shouted, waving his arms with all his might. He ran up to the dazed Alice and angrily yanked the photo out of her hands. He then began to crumple the image in his hands with great diligence. He then tossed the result of his actions into a trash garbage can. Turning to Alice, he irritably asked her why she was always goofing off at work, and without waiting for an answer, urged her to take her work more seriously. Alice looked at him with her big pink eyes in confusion and bewilderment. Then she sighed noisily and lowered her head resentfully in thoughtfulness. Aiden didn't like Alyssa's reaction, glaring at her angrily. The electric train rode over the bridge over the river, lit by the lights of the evening city, taking employees home from work. Moving through the transportation, Aiden was tormented by the thought of what was wrong with Alice and what she thought he was her toy. The next day, coming to the office, he was still thinking about the job, which he called not a playground, and that everything has a limit, and he can't take it anymore. Something fell near Aiden, he said Alice's name perplexedly, and sat down to straighten the crumpled leaf. He leaned over the unfolded image, holding it with both hands, and began to examine it. It had a picture of Alice on it, the one he'd crumpled and thrown away yesterday. Aiden said her name again in surprise. Alice and her drinks. Another day at work. Aiden slumped back in his chair, exhausted. Alyssa approached him and asked if he really hadn't slept for 3 days in a row, noting that he looked like a zombie. Aiden replied that he didn't have the energy to talk to her. He went on to say that he didn't have time to talk to her, as he had to finish his presentation and wanted to say something else. Alice suddenly interrupted his speech, remembering something. Aiden turned around with a frown. With a welcoming smile, she said she had already finished his presentation, emailed it, and it was even approved, and she had also designed a business card. The words brought tears to Aiden's eyes. He thought that even though Alice was always laughing at him, she really was. Alice interrupted his thoughts by suddenly walking over and leaning over to his chair. She grinned, covering herself with her hand, and asked if he was crying, and afterward wondered what he would do without her. Her chuckle made Aiden think she'd only helped him to show off. That made him a little angry. A coworker sitting at a nearby table called Aiden by his last name, and he immediately responded. His office neighbor said Aiden should attend tonight's party, much to his surprise. Alice immediately called back from behind her desk, telling her boss not to worry as she would help him with the drinks. With a playful wink and a smile, she told him she could buy what she would pour for everyone. Frowning, Aiden thought she would laugh later, but still he needed her help. The restaurant where the party was held was called Starry Night. Its sign brightly lit up the street at night. Alice decided to do the cocktail mixing herself. She asked if everyone was ready and warned that her drinks were too strong, and everyone needed to make sure they could handle them before drinking. Aiden watched surprised and confused as she waved the liquor bottle around. Alice, smiling, was enthusiastically shaking her cocktail. It looked like she was having a lot of fun. Aiden watched in silence with his mouth hanging open in surprise. He didn't understand why she was stirring things up. Meanwhile, Alice was already pouring her drink into a large cup while saying that she doesn't mix her drinks in a small cup, because everyone here isn't that weak. Aiden had tears in his eyes again. The thought flashed through his mind that he thought she was here to help him. Smiling slyly, Alice said that she hoped no one would refuse and ruin everyone's mood. Aiden thought frustratingly about getting back at Alice and making her regret it. Alice continued to rouse the attendees, pouring full cups for everyone and cheering them on. Suddenly, she turned to Aiden, pointing at him and stating that it was his turn. Alice shoved a full cup into his hands and began shouting at him to drink and act like a man. Aiden sat with a cup in his hands while Alyssa cheered him on, thinking that he shouldn't have trusted her. Finally, making up his mind, he brought the cup to his mouth with the thought that he would just drink it all and die. Taking the first sips, Aiden thought about the fact that he would appear in Alice's dreams every night and torment her. Suddenly he stopped, tasting the contents of the cup. It wasn't alcohol, just water. Alyssa, meanwhile, continued to amuse those present, and asked who was next. Aiden looked in her direction in surprise. On the bench where she was sitting, he saw that there was a bottle of mineral water next to her. Alice twirled the bottle masterfully in her hands, shaking its contents. She had a cheerful smile on her face. Aiden watched her actions mesmerized, his eyes wide. With a light motion of her hand, Alyssa opened the bottle. She smiled and winked at Aiden, then announced that the next drink was on its way. Alice and her button. The start of the workday. Alyssa, smiling affably, said hello to Aiden, wishing him a good morning. Aiden turned around with a wary look, as if he'd noticed something amiss in her appearance. He noticed that the buttons on her shirt were not buttoned correctly, as she had missed one loop. Alyssa walked to her workstation, complaining about the heat and saying that it felt like it was still summer outside. Aiden glanced at her from his chair. Sitting down at her desk, Alyssa began thinking out loud about what she should do first. Aiden continued to glare at her. He thought wistfully about how clumsy she was, and she should have looked in the mirror before she left the house, because you could see through the hole in her shirt. The hands of the wall clock in the office showed 12 o'clock, lunch break time. Excitedly exclaiming that it was time for lunch, Alice sat down at the table and picked up her chopsticks, ready to take on her meal. They were eating spaghetti. Aiden ate slowly, carefully, and according to the rules of etiquette. Alice, on the contrary, swallowed the food in large quantities and with 4 chopsticks at once. Aiden, looking at Alyssa, noticed that the button on her blouse was buttoned incorrectly. As they ate, Aiden began to worry that she still hadn't buttoned her button. He resented the fact that she could walk for hours like she hadn't looked in the mirror all morning. To distract himself, Aiden sped up and began to fill his mouth full. Alyssa interrupted her lunch, observing the change in his demeanor. Lunch was over, and the staff began their work duties. Aiden was helping to sort through an article in which Alyssa was interested in the problem of one headline which she saw as being too dark or too big. At this time, Aiden couldn't concentrate on his work, as Alyssa leaned over him, and he could see the improperly buttoned blouse all too clearly. He thought about how he needed to keep his eyes off the button since he couldn't concentrate, and that he should tell her that. Aiden mustered the strength to call out to Alice, but decided to run the conversation through to himself first in order to prepare himself. In my imagination, I pictured Alice covering herself from all sides in horror, after his words about her improperly buttoning her shirt. She continues to cover the buttons with one hand, calling only Aiden's name and not finishing the sentence. Finally frightened, and with tears in her eyes, Alice asks if he always stares at her shirt like that. After replaying the outcome of the dialogue in his head and deciding that this was what was likely to happen, Aiden decided not to pay attention to the wrong button. As time passed, Alyssa brought Aiden the report and he made sure she still hadn't buttoned up. He frowned, saddened by this. Meanwhile, she nonchalantly made her way to her workstation. Walking past Aiden again, Alyssa reached out with a smile, unreservedly convincing her superior that the button continued to be out of place. Aiden sat exhausted, not knowing what to do in the situation. The workday was coming to an end, and Aiden thought it was not appropriate for Alice to go home looking like this. He imagined how all the people would stare at her improperly buttoned shirt in transportation, and how unpleasant it must be. At the last moment, Aiden dared to tell Alyssa about her appearance problem and called out loudly to her. She turned around in surprise with an innocent look full of attention and asked politely what he needed. Aiden's gaze turned fierce as he saw that all the buttons were in their place as if nothing had happened. Aiden and Alyssa stared at each other in silence. Aiden then decided to finally break the lingering pause by saying goodbye to Alyssa until tomorrow. Alice cheerfully replied goodbye to the boss, who unlike her was in a bad mood. Aiden escorted a glance at Alyssa, who had taken the elevator at the same time. The unresolved questions of the day continued to swarm in the chief's mind. Alice was also pensive. She was thinking about the impression her boss had of today. Looking at the button, she began to laugh, remembering how she had embarrassed Aiden with her look all day. And Aiden was solving another question in his mind as to when she had time to fix things in her bow that he hadn't noticed. Alyssa and the outfit. In the middle of the workday, Alyssa approached the manager with a piece of paper in hand and asked him to take a look. Their conversation caught Aiden's attention. Alice and the manager were discussing choosing an outfit for the model for the flyer. One outfit was too revealing, the other too boring. Aiden, listening to the conversation, turned around and furtively glanced in their direction. Alice stood leaning against the manager's desk, with a thoughtful look of putting a pen in her mouth. Aiden figured she wasn't causing any trouble today, and was doing a fine job as long as she didn't fool around. Alice took the flyer and scratched the back of her head, studying its contents with a thoughtful hum. She turned to Aiden and was about to call out to him, hoping for help, but he cut her off at half a word, telling her to deal with it herself. Aiden thought he shouldn't give in to her, because she'd laugh at him again. Alice looked ingratiatingly at her boss over the pieces of paper, folding her lips into a tube. She was holding a flyer for a stationery store, and on it was a photo of a model in a blue dress and with dark hair, with roses drawn next to the model. Upon seeing the flyer, Aiden turned to Alyssa and addressed her indignantly, saying that it looked like they were selling everything but stationery. Alyssa replied that it was because he didn't want to help her. Going through the papers, Aiden thought he should have known she'd get it wrong. When Aiden chose the photo he wanted, he gave it to Alice, telling her to fix the flyer to this one. Alice said thoughtfully that this was what he liked. She stared intently at the photo, scrutinizing every detail of it closely and intently. The next day, Alice came to work in a new outfit. She wore a short beige dress and a blue jacket over it, with a small brown backpack on her back. Walking past Aiden, she cast a glance at him, hoping to notice some sort of reaction. Unfortunately for her, it was impossible to get her superior's attention, and he remained unfazed. She walked past her boss again, peering playfully in his direction, but still to no avail. Alyssa continued to hover near Aiden, hoping that he would notice the change in her appearance. However, he only admonished her, telling her to get to work already. Alice let out a disappointed sigh and began to consider her next steps. It was time for lunch break. Aiden headed toward the microwave, but Alice blocked his path. Smiling slyly, she stood in front of him, spreading her arms to keep him from passing. Alyssa wasn't helped by her subterfuge. Leaning over, Aiden slipped under her arm. She sat at her desk after lunch, pouting, wondering what else she could do. Finally, Alice jumped up from her chair with determination, finally realizing what needed to be done. Walking up to her boss, she asked if he had noticed anything different with her. Turning around, Aiden looked at her intently while adjusting his glasses. Alice stood in front of him with an angry expression, resting her hands on her hips and covering her eyes. Opening one eye, she furtively glanced at her superior, waiting for his reaction. However, he only noticed that Alice was even more annoying today than usual. After these words, Alice's face twisted with resentment and indignation. A shiver ran through her body. She turned and ran out the door, saying she was going home. Aiden only had time to shout back that it wasn't 7 o'clock yet. However, Alice didn't even think to listen to his remarks and left, slamming the door loudly. After she left, Aiden noticed that he was mistaken, and in fact, it was well past 7. He was immersed in wondering why then Alice had stayed so late at work. Aiden's gaze fell on the photo on his desk. He remembered that it was the model he'd picked out the day before. She was dressed just as Alice had been that day. Aiden took the model's picture in his hands and stared at it for a long, thoughtful moment. Slowly, he began to guess the reason for such strange behavior of Alice during the day. She, meanwhile, was sitting on the street, on the side of the sidewalk, with a frustrated look. Next to her on the sidewalk was a glass with a drink and a pipe. Alice took the glass and shoved the tube into her mouth, biting down on it slightly out of irritation. She then quickly, in one fell swoop, emptied the glass, drinking all of her drink. Alice and the phone call. Aiden walked briskly into the office, apologizing to his colleagues for being late. One of the female employees responded with a greeting, "Good morning," but Alice didn't bother to say hello, but sat motionless, and didn't even turn her head. She sat with her head bowed low and strands of pink hair hanging from her forehead, and she was very upset about something. Aiden was quite surprised and stood motionless, amazed at this strange sight. He remembered Alice in her usual cheerful mood and thought that this was the first time he had seen her like this. Then the phone on Alice's desk rang. She trembled and was startled. Then she picked up her phone and took a quick step toward the hallway, Aiden giving Alyssa a glance. Aiden lurked outside the door, thinking that something had happened, and even though it was none of his business, he couldn't help but overhear. Alice, meanwhile, turned away from the wall and said on the phone that she'd never said anything like that, and that she didn't mean what she was saying. Aiden heard a male voice on the other end of the line asking ingratiatingly for Alice not to do something. With a dazed expression on her face, she replied that it was her place of work, and he couldn't do what he was going to do, and for him to forgive her this time. The phone conversation was over, and Aiden decided that someone was threatening Alice. The girl became upset again, and the supervisor thought about whether he had the right to interfere in her private life. Alice at this time covered her face with both hands and cried. The girl's concern kept Aiden on his toes. He wondered if he should just sit back and watch or if he should intervene in the situation. While he was thinking like that, Alice received a message on his computer in which someone wrote that she had better come because his patience was running out. Aiden was nearby at the time and managed to read everything before she pressed the message. The warden went over in his head the various options of who it could be. Ex-boyfriend, possessed, or stalker. The end of the workday was approaching, and Alice picked up her bag and apologized for needing to leave a little early today. It was beginning to rain outside, and Aiden thought about the fact that what was going on between Alice and the unknown man could be dangerous. The rain had intensified and was already washing the city, with its many skyscrapers, in a solid downpour. Alice walked barefoot through the city, squelching through puddles and kicking up splashes of water. Her shoes she was holding and her distraught appearance was complemented by her soaked hair and clothes. The street was deserted, and the rain continued to pour with the same force, not soon thinking of ending. Suddenly, the figure of Aiden appeared, rushing down the street in a torrential downpour. At that time, Alyssa was getting into a cab, and Aiden didn't catch up with her before she drove off. Getting into another car, he pointed the chauffeur in the direction of which car to drive, thinking that the rain had increased even more, although his heart was beating even harder. As Aiden rode in the car, he wondered what he could do to help Alyssa and why he was following her. He settled on the conclusion that no matter what happened, nothing mattered, and he had to protect her. While he was thinking that, Alyssa got out of the car, and Aiden pulled up close to her. There was a man standing on the porch in front of Alice's house that she made her way to. The rain continued to pour with the same force. Aiden lurked and listened behind a ledge in the wall of the house where he could see everything that was going on. Alice walked toward the stranger, all wet from the rain, his indistinct silhouette visible in the distance. Alice was almost to the point where she was only a few steps away from the stranger. It appeared that the man was wearing a uniform cap and was holding a massive box. The man turned out to be a mailman, who until that moment had been hidden by a wall of pouring rain. With undisguised anger, the mailman reminded Alice that he had warned her that massive packages were not kept in their warehouse. Aiden listened dumbfounded, standing as if dumbfounded, watered by the incessant rain. Alice cheerfully promised it was the last time, and the mailman reminded her that she'd said that before, and let him order the package to work next time, since he could just throw it away. Aiden continued to stare at the denouement of the situation, not moving from his seat as he couldn't check into reality. When she opened the package, Alice lifted it joyfully above her head. It was a toy, an animal, a hybrid of a bird and a dog. While she waved the toy merrily, Aiden, all wet from the rain, watched her from around the corner of the building. Then he hummed in relief, glad that it wasn't what he had assumed it would be. He turned around and went home, leaving behind a joyful Alice and the mailman who told her off. He thought he was glad nothing serious had happened. Later, at home, Alice was upset to find that this toy was 50 cents cheaper on another website. Alyssa and a steamy set. Alyssa and her boss were on their way to the office after visiting clients. Alyssa complained about being hungry and urged Aiden to go get something to eat before returning. The supervisor responded by saying that she had just eaten all the snacks from the clients, but Alyssa countered that it had been 20 minutes and her stomach was empty again. On top of that, she had 2 coupons with her for a discount at the diner. It flashed through Aiden's mind that it was no wonder she wanted to go with him. When they entered the diner, they sat down at a table. Alice grabbed the menu and began to speculate aloud about what they should eat. Aiden thought she was always so excited when it came to food. Alyssa said she was going to get her own pasta with melted cheese and asked Aiden what he was going to order. Aiden replied that he wanted to get the Turkish steak, but Alyssa interrupted him abruptly. She suggested ordering a paired set, because they should add a baked potato to it, and the whole order would be $3 cheaper. Aiden wanted to say something, but Alice interrupted him without so much as a word, and ordered a double set. The waitress took the order and said it would be ready in 20 minutes. Alyssa was excited about the order like a child. Meanwhile, Aiden was thinking that just because they ordered a couple's set didn't mean they were a couple. However, the order that was brought to them was clearly designed for a couple in love. The steak was decorated with a pattern drawn out of the sauce. In addition, the waitress wished them to enjoy their date. Aiden recoiled from the table in surprise. He was very much embarrassed, but Alice was fine with it. She found the ordering very cute, and took out her phone and started taking pictures of it. Grabbing a table knife, Aiden smeared the drawing on the steak with it before Alyssa could take a picture of it. To justify his action, he told her that the sauce needed to be spread evenly. A frustrated Alice began to cut the meat, and Aiden thought he was suddenly thirsty. He questioned a waitress passing by why they were only getting 1 drink. The waitress smiled affably in response, slightly hesitant to explain to him. She then used gestures to depict drinking the drink with a straw. She then mimed drinking through the same tube from the same glass on the other side, letting Aiden know that she and Alyssa shared the same glass. The waitress then grinned, winked at Aiden, and made an encouraging gesture in his direction. Aiden looked at her with a perplexed look, squinting his eyes suspiciously. Then he looked at Alice sitting across from him. She was drinking from a large glass through a single straw. After drinking, Alyssa handed the drink to Aiden. He tensed, not knowing what to do. Determined, Aiden removed the tube and took a volley of the drink directly from the glass. After that, they continued eating. Alice was upset again, and Aiden thought that she must be too young to think about such things. But at his age, all this stuff made him uncomfortable, because they weren't even dating. He sat there, immersed in his thoughts, until he noticed out of the corner of his eye that someone had approached them. There were 3 people with ridiculous hats and musical instruments standing by the table. They were the staff of the diner. They congratulated Aiden and Alice, saying that they were the 50th couple to order a couple's set, and offered to serenade them. The staff began playing instruments and singing while Aiden and Alyssa watched them. This went on for a while. Aiden was confused and didn't know how to react. Alice jumped up from the table and began to dance merrily next to the musicians, clapping her hands. Aiden watched the action in shock, mouth wide open, not knowing what to do. Alice danced to the music with joyful laughter while the Cassock diner staff congratulated them and wished them all the best. Aiden started to protest. He wanted to explain that he and Alyssa were not a couple at all. It was all to no avail. In the turmoil surrounding them, no one paid attention to his objections. Aiden was in a panic. He was ready to fall through the ground from embarrassment and shame. Alice, meanwhile, continued to party heartily, dancing and clapping her hands. When they left the diner, evening had fallen on the city. The walls of the surrounding houses looked pink in the setting sun. Alyssa happily recalled how great it had been and how full she'd gotten. Aiden replied that he didn't even want to remember, and it had been like a nightmare for him. Alice countered that everyone had been so happy. She offered to go to the diner again. When Aiden heard that, he turned around and looked at her angrily. Alice covered her eyes, smiled dreamily, and said that maybe they... She didn't finish the sentence, taking a long pause. Aiden looked at her in surprise, not realizing what she was going to tell him. Alice opened one eye, casting a long, puzzled look at her companion. Smiling broadly, she continued her speech, saying that then they could eat everything they ordered. They walked through the evening city, talking along the way. Alice suggested ordering 3 personalized sets next time. Aiden replied that it would be too much for 2. Alyssa countered that it would be 3 when they got back there. On the wall in the diner hung a board with pictures of the customers who came there to have a date. Aiden and Alice were in one of them. Alice in the picture grabbed her boss under the arm and dragged him to dance with her. The poor guy was very embarrassed and clearly out of his depth, but she was having a lot of fun. It was another day at work. Sitting at his desk, Aiden was deep in thought, looking at his subordinates. His gaze fell on Alice. She had a red piece of paper in her hands. It looked like she was making something out of it. She obviously wasn't thinking about work at all. All her attention was absorbed in her paper craft. Alice looked at the result of her labor with concentration, even tension, adding the finishing touches. Her tension transferred to her superior as well. Aiden watched her actions closely. With a cheerful smile, Alice showed the result of her efforts. She had a paper dragon in the palm of her hand. Aiden was involuntarily impressed with her origami skills. He thought it was amazing. He interrupted himself mentally, wondering what he was doing. Out loud, he asked Alice if she had any ideas. She replied that she didn't have any ideas yet. Another employee was dozing at the table next to them. The time was nearing noon. The hands of the office clock were already showing 10 to 3. Aiden couldn't think of anything during that time. He sat at his desk with a tired look, ignoring the employee who was dozing next to him. Aiden thought about how tedious this was. He took the pen in his hands and tried his best to get himself in the mood for work. Suddenly, Aiden thought his foot bumped into something under the table. He didn't realize what it was right away. It felt like someone's foot. Aiden thought he must have touched someone. Abruptly raising his head, he looked across the table at whoever was sitting on the other side. It was Alice. She looked up and stared back at him, a surprised expression on her face. Immediately afterward, the girl blushed thickly, as if embarrassed, and took her eyes aside. A hunch flashed through Aiden's mind that it was Alice's foot, and he hastily yanked his foot away. They sat across from each other, their cheeks red with embarrassment, their hearts racing. Aiden mentally hoped Alice didn't think he'd done it on purpose. Suddenly, Aiden flinched. He felt something again. In his mind, he let out a desperate cry. It was Alyssa's foot again. Aiden finally began to guess that she was flirting with him. In a panic, he mentally said her name. His anxiety grew more and more intense. Alyssa kept touching Aiden's leg with her foot, while he was worried that his foot might be dirty. At the same time, she was scratching something on the paper with a pen. And Aiden thought that if she kept touching him, then... He didn't finish his thought. Alice finished her drawing as evidenced by her soft cheer. She showed her work to Aiden. The drawing was of none other than him. Alice leaned over the table, showing her boss the result of her artistic endeavors. She said that the drawing was of him. At this, Alice still continued to touch his leg with her own, down below the table. 1,000 questions swarmed through Aiden's mind. Once again, he was completely confused. Suddenly, very embarrassed, Alice looked away, still holding the sheet in her hands. She laughed awkwardly and said she seemed to get carried away and was going to get coffee. Alice left the room, slamming the door behind her. Aiden looked at her puzzled. He could still feel the touch of someone's foot under the table. It was obvious now that it wasn't Alice. Aiden thought deeply about who in that case was actually flirting with him. Moving his gaze a little to the left, he saw the head of an elderly employee sprawled in the chair next to where Alice was sitting. He had moved out of the chair so that he was barely visible from behind the desk. Meanwhile, Alyssa crouched on the edge of the break room table with a cup of coffee in her hands. Immersed in thought, she stared before her with a pensive, hazy gaze. Lowering her eyes down, Alice looked at her feet, shod in light flip-flops. She leisurely rubbed one foot against the other, taking it out of her shoe and then slipping it back into the spanking. Then Alice, still sitting on the table, covered her eyes and took a long sip from her cup. Aiden, on the other hand, at his home, was washing his feet more thoroughly than usual this evening with curses. Alice and Christmas. It was Christmas evening. White snowflakes quietly descended from the sky, twinkling in the lights of the evening city. A man, exhausted by loneliness, remembered how last Christmas he had given his girlfriend his heart, but the next day she had returned it. It was Aiden who, warmly dressed, was handing out flyers in the freezing cold calling Mr. Kim's bakery. After a while, a tired and slightly cold Aiden began to reduce his speech to a word designation: pies. He did his job very insecurely, though kindly, and gradually people stopped taking flyers from him and just passed by. Aiden's mood worsened. He frowned angrily and folded his arms in front of him, lamenting the injustice of standing out here in the cold handing out flyers while being a designer for his major. After some hard thinking, Aiden's attention was captured by something else, and his angry gaze became focused. There were many couples walking down the street in love, who were holding hands, talking, hugging, warming each other's hands, and generally behaving freely and cheerfully. Sprinkled with evening flakes of snow, it dawned on Aiden that he missed having someone by his side right now. But then he came to the conclusion that he should not expect anything, as he was making himself even more miserable by doing so. The phone rang suddenly in Aiden's pocket, and he was confused as to who it could be. His subordinate called to say she was free and would come to help him. Aiden tried to persuade Alice to go home to rest, but she insisted that she still wanted to come and had already bought a suit. The fact that Alice had bought a costume puzzled Aiden. Shifting his eyebrows, he suspiciously began to ponder what it could be. With horror, he pictured Alice in her Santa Claus costume, which consisted of a short fur coat, a Christmas hat with a bow-on, and a huge sack of presents slung over her shoulder. From behind him, someone called his name. It was a girl with pink hair. He leisurely began to turn around, confused by his previous speculation and in anticipation of Alice's actual costume. She stood, arms at her sides, wearing a deer costume from which only her head was visible, wondering if he had waited for her too long. Aiden didn't appreciate Alyssa's costume, saying it didn't look good, to which Alyssa thoughtfully asked him if he was cold and offered to help him hand out flyers. With great enthusiasm and a radiant smile, she set about the task in front of a frowning coworker. Alice, ignoring Aiden, continued to pass out flyers praising the excellent pies of the bakery she was advertising. Suddenly, some child excitedly drew his mother's attention to Alice, as he really liked the horse costume. Captivated by the attention and wanting to make the child's pleasure and unforgettable emotions, Alice put him on her back and began to ride him, almost like a real horse, while they gesticulated together and laughed loudly. Aiden watched their amusement indulgently, showered with small snowflakes. As the ride ended, passers-by began stringing flyers on the antlers of the reindeer Alice was wearing, who obligingly tilted her head while continuing to laugh. Aiden felt annoyed at his subordinate's disregard for his work. Alice was worried, as she felt something wrong with her boss, who began to tremble while turning away from her. Aiden's face lowered and tears sputtered from his eyes. His mouth closed as he tried to find the strength to hold back and calm down. From under her pink bangs, Alice was looking at him at this time with reproachful and attentive eyes. Despite a day full of different experiences, Aiden thanked Alyssa for her help, who he decided had gotten things moving faster with the costume. Aiden asked Alyssa where she got such a costume, and she started rummaging around looking for something for him. Alice pulled out a cake, and with a happy smile she handed it to him, wishing him a Merry Christmas and justifying her generous gesture by saying that Aiden would probably be too embarrassed to buy his own cake, so she had decided to do it herself. Aiden was very surprised at this congratulation and stood like a dumbfounded man. He started to apologize for making Alice work. She replied that there was no problem and said goodbye to him until next week. Aiden watched Alice in her reindeer costume walk away into the illumination of the evening city. Sad and broken, she walked slowly, eyes downcast in heavy reflection. Already the windows in the apartment high-rises were lit. The weather was windless and snowy. Suddenly, Alice felt a touch on her shoulders, a warm red scarf around her neck that had been carefully tied for her by Aiden, who had caught up with her on the way. Alice was confused, her disheveled pink strands out of her costume, nicely edging her surprised face. Turning away from Alyssa, an embarrassed Aiden explained that he'd bought it in case she came over, and that she was dressed so warmly that he hadn't had a chance to give it to her early. When Aiden had gotten far enough away, he said goodbye to Alice, who held the scarf in her palms, feeling the warmth of the unexpected gift. She stared after him for a long time, standing motionless in one place. Then she pressed the scarf to her lips, closing her eyes in pleasure and smiling slightly. Alice and her social life. In the middle of the city is an office building owned by Gandai Business, as evidenced by the lettering and the logo on the facade. That's where Aiden and Alice came in. Aiden introduced himself and said he was from the marketing department, and they were here to meet Director Chung. Alice also introduced herself after him. The receptionist greeted them and asked them to wait in the office at the end of the hall. Aiden and Alice bowed politely, with Aiden thanking the receptionist. They walked to the office and sat on the large couch next to the door, waiting to be admitted. Alyssa laughed and said it was fun, since Aiden was so quiet and boring at work. Aiden replied that it was an $80,000 project, and they had to convince the company to work with them. Alice looked at Aiden with interest. He looked remarkably focused and determined. She said she loves that her boss is always so courteous to everyone. Alice then added with a serious expression that she admired this quality of his. Aiden was surprised, as he clearly hadn't expected her to think so highly of his professional skills. Slightly embarrassed, he replied that all adults are like that. Alice agreed, saying that she was always smiling, even when he yelled at her. Aiden countered that it was different. The office door creaked open, and the person who entered was happily surprised at who he saw. Aiden turned around at the voice. An elderly man entered and asked if they were waiting. It was Director Chung. Aiden greeted the principal and was about to introduce Alice to him, but Chung interrupted him. The director said he wondered where this wonderful fragrance was coming from, and he could not imagine such a beautiful flower being in his office. Aiden hadn't expected such behavior from the director. He clearly didn't like the familiarity with his subordinate. He shifted his gaze to Alice to see her reaction to the unexpected flood of compliments. Alice said hello with a smile, and said she was glad to meet her, and then introduced herself. The principal let loose another compliment, calling Alice a charmer. She replied that she heard that a lot. Aiden looked at her in surprise. He was slightly surprised that Alice was okay with this attitude from the principal. They sat down at the table, and Aiden showed the director their designs and added that he could trust Alice with all the projects. Chung replied that everything looked great, and he showered them with praise. The principal told Aiden that he was very jealous and wished they had a girl like that too. Hearing this, Aiden involuntarily clenched his hand into a fist under the table. Chung, meanwhile, continued his rant, saying that Aiden must be happy to come to work every day. Aiden was becoming increasingly irritated, and he mentally reprimanded himself, calling the principal an obscene word. Alyssa cheerfully replied to the principal that he was right, and at work, Aiden constantly refers to her, which bores her. The principal, laughing, said it was because Alice was so pretty, but she countered that it was because she was younger and better versed in new technology. Aiden wondered if he might be too susceptible, since Alice really didn't mind being treated that way. The meeting with the principal ended, and Aiden and Alyssa walked to the elevator to leave the building. They stood silently side by side in the stall. Aiden was still thinking about what had happened, not knowing what to do. Finally making a decision, he cautiously called Alice's name, trying not to show his concern. She immediately withdrew, directing her gaze in his direction in anticipation of what he would say. Aiden asked if she was satisfied with the way she had been treated there. Alice didn't answer right away, a little hesitant. She ended up saying with a smile that sometimes you just have to be patient, and she was fine. Aiden looked at her in surprise, as if he hadn't expected that answer. The day was drawing to a close. The house where Aiden lived was softly lit by the last rays of the setting sun. He sat on the bed and wondered at a loss whether he should have asked her about it at all, since she was clearly not well. Aiden chastised himself for not saying anything and wondered what he was afraid of. The image of Alice surfaced in his mind, the way she had answered the principal with a fake smile. Aiden thought brokenly that he was relieved that she took it that way, and he wouldn't have to interfere. Meanwhile, evening continued to descend on the city. Pink clouds floated leisurely over the rooftops. Alice was walking through the evening city heading home, her heels clacking loudly to the beat of her steps. Suddenly she froze, struck by an unpleasant memory, and whined to herself. The girl thought that if Aiden hadn't been with her, she might not have been able to control herself. Alice in her social life. Another working day in the office of MUI Design Studio. All employees were engaged in their routine duties. The phone on Aiden's desk suddenly rang loudly. Aiden saw that it was Director Chung. He picked up the phone. Alyssa, who was minding her own business nearby, heard their conversation. Aiden told the principal that he'd be there soon, then apologized and started stammering. Then he whispered into the receiver that Miss Alice had another appointment today. In response, Chung exclaimed that their project was very important and asked if she had said she didn't want to come. Aiden hastily countered that, of course not. Quietly approaching him, Alice caught his attention by touching his shoulder with her finger. With a friendly smile, she folded her fingers in a reassuring gesture, showing that everything was fine. Aiden looked doubtfully in her direction, wondering if everything was really okay. Soon they both arrived at the building where the Grande Buenas Company office was located. Aiden and Alice were sitting in the director's office. Alice was talking energetically about why they were proposing this concept. Namely, they thought it fit well with the company's image. The director nodded his head, agreeing with everything. Chung said that Alice did such a good job, and it's a pity she doesn't have a rich husband to rely on while she's vacationing at home. Alyssa countered that she was too young to get married. Aiden sat nearby, listening to the conversation. Chung told him that they should ask their director to give Alice a raise or a bonus. She deserves it as she brightens up the atmosphere in the whole room with her mere presence. Aiden gritted his teeth angrily. Alyssa raised her hand and objected, saying that she was really just causing trouble. Director Chung replied that with her looks, Alice would be able to make a lot of money just by selling water near this building. But Alice said with a smile to this that she definitely has no plans to sell water in the future. Aiden sat frowning, increasingly annoyed by the headmaster's cavalier behavior. Cheung turned to Alice with another question, but Aiden interrupted him, saying that Miss Young... He paused for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. Alyssa looked anxiously at her superior. Aiden pressed his lips together, thinking about how best to express his thoughts. Director Chung was silent, squinting his eyes and looking at Aiden intently, waiting to see what he would say. Aiden sternly told the principal that Alyssa was a talented person and a very important member of their team, and asked him to show some respect. Alice turned anxiously to her boss, but he continued to look at the principal with a stern expression. Chung was surprised, and incomprehensibly said he didn't recall being rude to her. Aiden angrily replied that the principal had been rude to her since the very first time they'd met. Alice shook her head fearfully, looking at one and the other. Director Chung let out a disdainful exclamation, expressing his displeasure while slightly fiddling. The principal asked if Aiden wanted to say that he should address Alice by her last name. After that, he slapped himself on the forehead and said that he agreed to call her Miss Young. He had forgotten that today's youth cared so much. Then the principal said that her name was Alice, so what was wrong with calling her by her first name? At that, Aiden asked the principal to apologize. Alice protested in a panic, asking him to stop. An angry Director Chung told them to leave as he would not accept their project. Aiden continued to demand an apology from the principal. A frightened Alice stared at him, not knowing what to do. Losing patience, Director Chung shouted loudly at them, demanding that they leave. Suddenly, someone else's voice was heard in the office, asking what was going on. An elderly gray-haired man with a big bald spot stood in the doorway. It was President Kim. Chung addressed him, saying that he had come at the right time because those two had made such a mess. But Kim didn't let him finish, saying that he had heard everything on his way here. The president continued, saying that he couldn't believe it and one couldn't work while seeing such behavior. Aiden sat silent with an angry look. Alice next to him lowered her head guiltily. Suddenly, President Kim replied that he was terribly sorry. Aiden turned his head in surprise, glaring at him. President Kim bent down in a bow, apologizing. He said he would handle Chung's re-education and remove him from this project, and then asked Aiden for further cooperation. Director Chung was very surprised. He clearly didn't expect this turn of events at all. President Kim walked out of the office, dragging Chung behind him by the hair, telling him to follow him and that maybe he should make his office into a storage room or something. Chung, letting out cries of pain, begged him to wait, to no avail. Aiden and Alice watched in silence. Both of them were shocked at what they saw, their faces expressing consternation and surprise. Aiden and Alyssa got into the elevator, and it whirred and carried them from the 8th floor down to the exit. They stood silently in the elevator. Aiden looked glum, still worried about the unpleasantness of the meeting. Alice showed no signs of anxiety. Suddenly, she noticed with concern that a shiver was running through Aiden's body as if from chills. From the excitement, he felt his knees tremble. Then his legs suddenly went under. Standing nearby, Alyssa scooped Aiden up under her arm, helping him to his feet. Aiden threw her an astonished look, not expecting her to show such concern. Smiling affectionately, Alice said that if he needed help, she was there for him. Aiden considered her words in surprise for a while, not knowing what to say in response. Then he smiled cheerfully and happily, and pronounced that they had done a good job today. Alyssa, and a day off. Aiden and Alyssa sat across the table from each other at work and flipped through notepads of flyers. Alyssa annoyedly said that there was nothing to work on. Aiden replied that it was because all flyers looked alike. In silence, they continued leafing through their notebooks, finding no other activities to do. Alice said with a bored look that the weekend would start tomorrow and she had nothing at all to do. Then she furtively glanced at Aiden with one eye, wanting to see his reaction to her words. Aiden looked back at her with an incomprehensible look, wondering what that was all about. He then replied that working on weekdays and relaxing on weekends was their life. Alice said she already knew that. They went back to looking at the flyers and did that boring thing for a while longer. Then Alyssa, tearing herself away from her notebook, asked Aiden what he usually did on the weekends. Aiden thought for a moment, holding his pen in his hands. He went over all his homework in his mind. Aiden answered Alice that he was watching TV, reading, and sleeping. Alice asked if he had any plans for tomorrow. Aiden replied that all his weekends were the same. Alice cheerfully said that meant neither of them had plans for tomorrow. Aiden looked at her again incomprehensively, wondering exactly what she meant. Alice looked at him expectantly, waiting to see what he would do next. Aiden said that he thought everyone had, and asked if she agreed with his opinion. Alice didn't know what to say out of surprise, and Aiden continued flipping through the pictures. Annoyed, Alice leaned back in her chair and yawned as Aiden continued to go about his business. She stared up at the ceiling, gathering her thoughts and wondering how to continue the conversation. Determined, she said she'd heard that the new Transnormal movie was very good. Aiden asked absently if that was true. Alyssa replied that she really wanted to see it. Aiden just hummed thoughtfully. Alice said with a determined look on her face that she wanted to watch it this weekend. Aiden stared at her in surprise, not understanding the purpose of her telling him this. Alice excitedly looked straight at him, hoping he would make the right decision. Aiden went back to her pictures and said that since she didn't have any plans, she should go to the movie. Angry Alice silently also began noisily flipping through the photos, frowning her eyebrows. Aiden stared at her incomprehensibly, at a loss to guess what had caused such displeasure. Finished with her work, Alyssa got up from her seat and, after muttering that she would see Aiden next week, headed home. Aiden rode the bus home, holding onto the handrail, and thought about the reason for Alice's strange behavior. At home, lying in bed under the covers, he continued to ponder the same topic. Slowly, Aiden, tired from his endless musings, began to drift off to sleep. Suddenly, he jumped up, startled by a sudden realization. The thought flashed through his mind that Alice had meant that she wanted to watch the movie with him. Aiden quickly reached for his phone, thinking he should text her right now. But as he dialed her number, his finger hesitated over the call button. Sitting down on the bed, Aiden thought it was well past midnight and he shouldn't do this. After all, it was too late. Besides, if she already had plans, he might disturb her. Besides, Aiden didn't rule out the possibility that he had misjudged her intentions. Collapsing onto his pillow, he mentally told himself to pull himself together. After all, Alice had no reason to want to see him on the weekend either. They already saw each other every day at work after all. With these thoughts, Aiden closed his eyes and decided to try to sleep soon. At this time, the movie theater's website was open on Alice's smartphone screen, and she was about to cancel the purchase of 2 tickets. Alice sat on her bed in her home clothes, tensely holding her phone in her hands. Slowly, as if reluctantly, she brought her finger to the button canceling the purchase. Then, making up her mind, Alice pressed the button after all. With a frustrated look, she glanced at the website's message that the purchase had been canceled. Then she dropped her head back down onto the pillow, tossing the phone next to her on the bed. Unhappy thoughts swarmed in her head that she so knew where today's conversation would lead. Sadly closing her eyes, Alyssa lamented the fact that Aiden wasn't interested at all. As she fell asleep, she mentally called him a jackass. Aiden was finally asleep at the same time. Alice and the weekend. Aiden stood alone in front of the movie theater, looking at the poster. He was surrounded by crowds of people going to the show. Couples could be seen here and there among the moviegoers. Aiden thought about how awkward it was to go to the movies alone. Suddenly, he heard someone call his name. Aiden looked around for the person who had called him. Alice was standing next to him, and it was she who addressed him. Alice asked if he had come to the movie alone, as she had. Aiden, a little embarrassed, replied to her that he had just heard the movie was good. Alice happily grabbed him under his arm, snuggling up to him without a shadow of embarrassment. Smiling cheerfully, she said she was afraid she'd have to watch the movie alone. Aiden looked at her with a slightly surprised look, but didn't object. Unfortunately for Aiden, Alice's appearance was just a fantasy. Walking alone down the street, he wondered what the chances were that it would happen, because he didn't know what theater she'd be at, what time she'd be there, or even if she wouldn't go tonight. Back at the theater, Aiden decided to see how good this movie was, convincing himself that he was just curious. He was sitting in a movie theater with a bucket of popcorn. There was swearing and yelling coming from the screen. Obviously, it was some kind of action movie. Finally, the movie came to an end with a sign on the big screen saying it was over. As he left the hall, Aiden looked around, hoping in vain to see Alice in the crowd of onlookers. Once outside, he took a seat on the curb under a tree, next door to the other walkers. Aiden took a deep breath, wondering what on earth he was doing. He rose leisurely to his feet, intending to go home. Moving slowly down the street, he passed an advertisement poster hanging on the wall. The poster depicted a man and a woman looking at each other in the sunset light. Aiden turned back to the advertisement, though he was about to walk past it as he remembered something. He remembered that this was the ad he and Alice had been looking for yesterday. Aiden pulled his phone out of his pocket, about to take a picture of the poster. Pointing his phone camera at the advertisement, he noticed someone standing next to him. Feeling it was someone familiar, Aiden quickly turned around and looked at the man standing next to him. It was Alice. She looked at Aiden in surprise, as if she hadn't expected to see him here. Aiden said he hadn't expected to see her here and asked if she'd seen the movie. Alice replied that she had no one to watch the movie with and was just walking around nearby. They were silent for a while, looking at each other and wondering how to continue the conversation. Aiden then asked Alice if she had eaten lunch. Alice replied that she hadn't yet. Aiden, slightly worried, suggested she have lunch together. Alice's breath caught from surprise. She pressed her hand to her chest excitedly. She soon came to her senses, however, and a sly smile appeared on her face. Alyssa clarified that Aiden really wanted to eat lunch with her on his day off too, since they ate together every day. Aiden agreed, and after saying goodbye, he was about to leave. But Alice stopped him and said that she hadn't eaten at home, and then called Aiden to eat with her. Alyssa said she was sure Aiden didn't even have food at home. Aiden objected, saying that there was. Alice replied that he was lying. Smiling cheerfully, the two of them walked down the street, Aiden in front, Alyssa slightly behind. A while back, in a movie theater, Aiden had been staring at the screen where a battle between characters in a movie was unfolding. He watched the movie while munching popcorn and paid no attention to anything else. Aiden didn't notice Alyssa, who was a few rows behind him, also watching the movie. Alyssa and Aiden's classmate. Alyssa and Aiden stopped outside a large building and he told her of another client had recommended them. Aiden said he couldn't believe that a small company like theirs was working with the largest advertising agency in the country. Alice didn't share his uncertainty, saying he should be proud of it and advising him not to belittle himself. Glowing with joy and inspiration, she reminded Aiden that they were working together and he had nothing to worry about. Aiden looked at her with surprised, wide eyes, not too influenced by her combative attitude. Already walking ahead of Alice, he said he wasn't worried, only afraid they would look down on them. Alice, all in soft pink and with the same hair, eyes, and eyebrows, was romantic and mysterious, and thought only of the two of them. Then they went to the door of the meeting room they were to enter. A beautiful girl with long dark hair met them on the doorstep and looked at Aiden in surprise as she said his name. Then she decided to clarify if he really was Aiden. Aiden stood puzzled and uttered only one name of the girl's name: Lily. After that, Lily reached for Aiden's hands and took them firmly with both of her own. She said she couldn't believe she was seeing him here. Aiden replied that he was very happy to meet her, and that he didn't know she worked here. Lily asked him about how long it had been since they'd seen each other. Aiden replied that it had been since she'd gotten her first job. The whole time of the dialogue, they did not let go of each other's hands, not looking at Alice, who was watching them in surprise. Lily was very happy and excited about seeing an old acquaintance. Alice took a deep intake of air into her mouth and exhaled, doing so to calm herself and gather her wits. It was already time on the wall clock, a few minutes to 7. Lily and Aiden discussed mutual acquaintances. He said that Mike was still the same, and she told him that it was because Aiden was bothering him a lot. By the way, Aiden remarked to Lily that Mike had a girlfriend. This conversation saddened Alice, and she lowered her head sadly, in a vague perception of what was happening. At Aiden's next happy memory, he was called out by Alice. He only glanced in her direction, animatedly and casually continuing his story. Alice finally entered the conversation, reminding them that it was time for them to talk about work, which caused both coworkers to be puzzled. Lily excitedly said it was her fault. The weather outside, where all 3 colleagues were headed, was warm and clear with large working buildings against a pale blue sky with white clouds. Already saying goodbye to Lily, Aiden had told her he'd call her as soon as the project was ready. She'd clarified his how about what they'd talked about before. Lily clarified that she meant that, to sit in the very bar they used to frequent. Aiden seconded the motion, saying it was great and asking if they were still working. Then he turned to Alice, stopped smiling with a shy look, said goodbye to her until tomorrow. Lily also said bye, continuing to smile happily. They walked together ahead of Alice, talking animatedly and laughing merrily. Absorbed in the conversation, they gesticulated vigorously while looking at each other. While doing so, Lily ran her hand over Aiden's shoulder and arm while continuing the conversation. Alice stopped and stared dumbfounded at their enjoyment of each other's company. Then she turned around and walked the other way down the empty street, holding her work briefcase in front of her. She grew farther and farther away from the place of their parting, heading for her home in heavy reflection. By the edge of her ear, she could still hear scraps of phrases in their voices, but as they grew farther away, she stopped hearing them. Aiden turned his head toward Alice one last time, thinking of her sadly. She had almost reached the intersection at this time, standing out well bright against the gray city. Aiden turned back and continued walking beside Lily. The liveliness of their conversation diminished. The sky turned gray with a large comet visible in the middle of the faded clouds. It snowed in big flakes in the city, and it was cozy and cheerful outside. The people whom the saddened Alice passed by were chatting animatedly and cheerfully with each other. Her steps in warm tights and black boots quickened, treading the snow-covered sidewalk. Walking past the windows of numerous stores and not paying attention to anything, she suddenly stopped halfway through. Her eyes filled with tears and she began to cry, snowflakes showering down in the frosty air. Alice in waiting. Alice walked alone down an empty city street, holding her briefcase under her arm. The picture popped into Aiden's mind and threw him into confusion. He froze with a confused expression on his face. Lily noticed the change in Aiden's mood. She glared at him, guessing what was wrong. She asked Aiden if he was thinking about Alice. He answered embarrassedly that he didn't. Why would he think about her? Lily said that Alyssa didn't seem all that happy to see Aiden talking to her and wondered if it bothered him. Aiden stammered, the question embarrassing him even more. He blushed thickly. Aiden then said that Alyssa probably just didn't want to work overtime. Lily, grinning, said that he'd always been like that. She continued by talking about how Aiden always finds a reason to deny that someone likes him. In response, Aiden only looked at her, thoughtful. He'd never noticed anything like this before. He then said he never did that, and who could like a guy like him? Lily asked if he wanted her to tell him something. She then continued by saying that she was sure Alice was still where she had parted ways. Aiden looked at Lily again with a surprised look, wondering if she might be right. Then he grinned, realizing that it was most likely exactly as she had said. White snow was falling thickly from the frowning sky, gradually covering the evening city. Aiden glanced up. He began to worry about Alice, who was left behind, alone in the cold. Walking beside Lily, Aiden gradually slowed his steps and then stopped altogether. Lily was surprised to suddenly find that Aiden wasn't around and had fallen behind her. Looking around, she found him standing behind her with his briefcase under his arm. Aiden stood a few steps away from Lily. He turned to her uncertainly, not knowing where to begin. Eventually, he squeezed out that he'd forgotten something important at work, then apologized and suggested we go to a bar next time. In response, Lily only looked at him thoughtfully with a slightly saddened look. Then she smiled understandingly and waved Aiden off, saying goodbye and wishing him luck. Aiden was in a great hurry. He walked briskly down the street that was slowly being covered in snow. He almost broke into a run, steam billowing out of his mouth and his face covered in drops of sweat. There were dozens of people walking down the street, but the one Aiden was looking for was not visible among them. His eyes darted from side to side, hoping to see Alice among the crowd. He looked around as he thought he saw someone familiar, and so it was. A silhouette very similar to Alice could be seen among the passers-by walking along the street. Aiden's gaze fixed on the silhouette that resembled Alice. He stared at her, not taking his eyes off her lest he lose her in the crowd again. Smiling happily, he ran forward, making his way among the passers-by. Calling Alice's name, he ran up to her. The girl heard his voice and began to turn around. Aiden froze awkwardly in place and staggered back in surprise when he saw who he had stopped. It was a complete stranger wearing glasses, also looking much older than Alice. She didn't seem to realize who had called out to her and stood looking around perplexed. Then, cursing irritably, the older woman turned away and went about her business. Aiden remained standing in the middle of the street. For a while he was completely confused. Then Aiden grinned, laughing to himself. He seemed to have our way out of this situation. He mentally called himself an idiot and wondered why Alice would even be here, then reached into his pocket for his phone. Pulling out his phone, Aiden began to quickly type a message on it. Immersed in his occupation, he shifted his seat and walked slowly forward without looking in front of him. Meanwhile, in the distance between the silhouettes of passers-by, Alice appeared, sitting on the parapet under a tree. She was holding the phone that had just gotten a text from Aiden. There were several messages. In the first two, Aiden called Alice by name. In the third, he informed her that it was too cold outside and he was going home too, and also informed her that they had done a good job today. For a while, Alice just sat silently with the phone in her hands, staring at the screen. Then she sniffed her nose angrily, annoyed that Aiden had caused her so much trouble. However, afterward, Alice smiled happily, leaving all resentment and worries behind. Alice and two servings. Sitting at her desk during a work meeting, Lily asked if she had confessed to him. Aiden, sitting next to her with a stack of paper in his hands, briefly sank into thought. He then replied convincingly that he'd already said that she'd never love an old man like him. Lily objected, saying she didn't believe it and was sure she was sending him a bunch of signals, to which Aiden replied that there were absolutely no signals. Lily asked if Aiden had looked at her online profiles, since there must be something there. He countered that he didn't need to check her profiles, and suggested that they continue the meeting. He was thoroughly embarrassed. Lily looked at him angrily, and they continued their work. It was evening. The sun had gone below the horizon, the last lights of the sunset reflecting off the windows of Aiden's house. Lying in his bed, Aiden wondered why Lily was doing this. After all, he was 10 years older than Alice, and there was no way she liked him. Silently, he continued to lie motionless, covered by the blanket and trying to sleep. But sleep wasn't coming, and Aiden's hand involuntarily reached for the phone lying next to him. Taking his phone off the charger, Aiden looked at the social network where Alyssa was registered. He found her profile, marveling at the strange picture she'd put up. Excitedly, Aiden flipped through the pages, himself having no idea what he was looking for. In one photo, Alice was holding 2 barbecues. The caption said they were good and she'd be back there again. The next photo showed Alice standing in the same pose with squid tentacles, also with 2 portions. The caption was similar. Aiden continued flipping through Alice's profile, puzzled. In the next photo, Alice posed exactly the same way, but with ice cream. In the next photo, she posed with carrot cakes. The caption mentioned that they are sold near her work. Aiden thought she was eating so much and her pose was the same. He wondered why she always had 2 servings, and how she even took the picture, since it wasn't selfies. Suddenly a hunch hit him, why everywhere else Alice ordered exactly 2 servings. Lily's words about the bunch of signals she thought Alice should be sending him came to his mind. In excitement, he sat up on the bed, wondering if this could be what he had guessed. Alice appeared before Aiden's mind's eye with 2 ice cream cones. She held out one cone to him, saying that she always ordered 2 scoops to show her desire to be with someone. Sitting up on the bed, Aiden excitedly thought that if his hunch was correct, it meant... Morning came, Aiden and Alyssa headed off to work. They walked side by side down the street, Alyssa calmly, and Aiden thought about Alyssa's page and the signs she might be making. Suddenly he noticed the sign of the pastry shop, and remembered that it sold the very pies he had seen on her page. A picture of a satisfied Alice, holding a slice of carrot cakes poked on a fork in both hands, holding one out towards him, and informing him that she would return to this establishment again. Aiden, pointing to the pastry shop, told Alice that he'd heard there were carrot cakes here. She approved of his hesitant phrasing, saying that she loved them, and suggested that she come in. He marveled at her determination with which she pulled him by the hand, and at her happiness. Aiden thought, Alice must have really wanted to eat them with someone. She happily held the delicate and appetizing carrot cakes poked on forks in her hands and was very pleased. He looked at her puzzled, over his plate of dessert, hesitant to eat. Aiden asked Alice, who was munching away, why she'd taken 2 portions since she'd just had lunch. She was surprised to hear what he meant. She then happily handed him a piece of the appetizing brownie, advising him to always take 2 servings for dessert. Aiden paused in deep thought at his unexpected inferences. After that, he closed his eyes and his face lit up with a slight smile. He thought about the fact that the meaning of Alice's actions with the sweets was quite different, and how he could not have guessed it before. Aiden told Alyssa that large amounts of sugar would be bad for her, to which she countered that anything that made her happy was good for her. Night had fallen in the city. The lights went out in most apartments, and in some, people were still awake. Alice was lying on the bed, in her cozy pink bedroom in her pajamas, and writing something on her phone. Her gaze was focused on what she was doing, the phone she brought close to her face. Afterward, she laid him down on the bed, preparing to retire to sleep. Alice was sound asleep, illuminated by the moonlight pouring in through the unshaded window. Aiden went on social media at this time too, and was surprised at what he saw. On Alice Jung's page, there was a status with a heart, saying that everything worked out. Lying on the bed next to his talking robot, and still holding the phone in his hand, Aiden wondered what it could mean.